Let's take a look at how self-sufficiency can be achieved on 5 acres of land. How much space do you need for produce? How many animals do you need to feed your family with all of the milk, eggs and meat required for a household? If you've got 5 acres, can all of those animals be kept and sufficiently fed only with what grows there naturally? Well, the answer is yes. You can be self-sufficient on 5 acres without buying feed at all. You just need to plan wisely, and know what livestock and how many of each to settle on. And just so you know, you just need 3 kinds of animals. That's it. They'll provide you with all of the variation on your plate and on your land. Those 3 species on their own won't decimate a field if you know how many to keep of each. So let's jump in and crunch some numbers. Here we go. What does self-sufficiency mean to you? Before we start with our breakdown, we need to look at some variables that will be unique to your land that can't possibly be summed up in one video. Living in the hot Arizona desert compared to living in Midwestern grasslands or in the icy yet densely forested Alaskan wilderness are going to require 2 vastly different sets of needs. Fuel from timber from just an acre of land is more than feasible in the northern hemisphere, but it's impossible to get that much wood in the grasslands or desert on an acre of land. The same holds true for water, the amount of sunlight you have available to be completely supplied for your solar panels. And then there's the amount of natural forage available for your animals. We also need to be realistic about what sustainability is. Are you really going to buy absolutely nothing from the store? Light bulbs? A new shovel when the old one wears out? Gas for your truck? And even when you put all of the electronics, building materials, repairs and replacements aside, can you really grow enough grain to sustain a family? Well, it's definitely possible, but most of us don't have, nor can we afford, a dozen hands to help with the workload required just to grow the amount of grains that the average family consumes in a year. Aim for 70% self-sufficiency. If you can cover 70% of you and your animals' needs without the help of outside sources, then you will be able to survive relatively comfortably if the grid goes down tomorrow and you're forced to rely solely on what your land can provide. So predictably, we're going to exclude factors like solar, wood fuel, and water availability. Instead, we'll be looking at just the 5 acres of space and the nutritional needs of the average household, with the thought that you could feasibly make an income from that land too. We're also going to look at this by average estimates, the average American diet that includes grains, animal protein, veg, and fruits. In other words, a little bit of everything fit for a family of 5 or 6. Then there's one final point to make. No matter how much or how little land you've got to work with, right off the bat, you're going to set aside 1 acre before you've put a single cow, chicken, or sheep on that space. That acre will hold your home, a barn, enough room for a chicken coop, a sizable vegetable patch, and then whatever is left is going to be filled with as many fruit trees that you can fit into that remaining space. We're going to have a look at the animals and how many to keep in just a second. Let's just quickly go over the produce before we get to the animals. Garden space. Growing enough fruit and vegetables for the average family really doesn't require much land at all. 1,000 square feet is more than enough to grow vegetables for the whole family for fresh eating, with plenty left over for freezing, canning, and you'll still have plenty for your animals too. To put that into perspective, that's less than 0.30 of an acre. Even after all of that, you'll still have enough room for an orchard, a jungle gym for the kids, and enough growing space to sustain a market garden on top of that. You don't have to overthink that acre around your home. It'll be plenty big enough to grow the immediate necessities for the dinner table, and then some. Animals? Now let's look at the other 4 acres and the animals that can be run on that land. We have to be realistic here again, and unfortunately that means excluding some of the more desirable livestock. Cattle are just going to require too much feed for you to feasibly keep them on 5 acres. Under the best circumstances, with all of the grass and rain you could ask for, every head of cattle needs at least an acre to sustain themselves from grazing alone. That's 1 acre each. And we're being generous here, the true stats lie somewhere closer to 1.4 acres per head. But if you rotationally graze and have optimal conditions, then you can bring it down to 1 acre without bringing in any additional feed. 5 acres just is not sufficient to carry cattle. Even if you exclude the beef and plan on just getting dairy from them, you'll still need at least 2 cows to time their lactation periods so that you can have milk all year round. As you can probably already tell, keeping cattle on 5 acres of land just isn't feasible no matter how ideal your grazing is. Sure, you can bring feed in for them, but isn't the entire point of this to avoid being reliant on outside sources for your food? Another problem with feeding cattle from pasture, even though it is the ideal way to go, is that they're not capable of consuming half of what grows naturally. Cattle's digestive tracts are incredibly selective about what they can and should eat. That brings us to pigs. They are even heavier feeders than the cattle are, and the bulk of that feed needs to be carbohydrates. You can throw all of the kitchen scraps and restaurant cast-outs at them, and you still have to bring in corn to make up their carbohydrate needs. If every individual human requires half of an acre's worth of grain, then a few pigs are going to equate to multiple acres that you just can't afford to give up. Don't worry though, it's not all doom and gloom. There are still other options for milk and meat out there, you just have to know where to look. But before we get to the milk and the red meat, let's start at the smallest and most obvious of the livestock, the chickens. Yes, you can keep quail or ducks, but chickens are easier to feed from scraps, and they can forage if you make use of chicken tractors. We're not considering free-range chickens here, because the 4 acres you have left are going to be utilized for other things that we'll get into in just a second. You'll have your egg-laying flock on one side, and the meat chickens on the other. The egg layers will also be making up your breeding stock, constantly resupplying your meat chickens as you slaughter them. 2 chickens per person for eggs should be sufficient, with 5 additional hens added to the mix for those extra eggs needed for hatching. So a family of 5 would have about 15 or so hens, as well as a rooster cooped together. Equating the meat chickens is somewhat different. We all have different preferences. Some will eat more and some less. And we want to give you comfortable estimates. We're not going by the absolute least amounts at all. These numbers are calculated with as many individuals as possible in mind, from the toddler to the average required adult intake, and all the way to the ravenous growing teenager. The rule of thumb is that every person in the household should have 15 chickens allotted to them for eating for the whole year. It's going to depend on you how many you keep at a time. You can do one major slaughter of 75 to 100 chickens once a year, or do smaller flocks of 20 every 3 months, which will leave you with a few extra carcasses just in case. Keep in mind, we're still keeping the chickens, both the layers and the meat chickens, on that first acre that's been put aside for the vegetables, fruit, and buildings. We've still got 4 acres left to work with here, and all of your other livestock won't be spread out over the whole 4 acres. Instead, they'll be sharing an acre or 2 at a time, so that you can rotationally graze them for free. As 1 acre recovers, they're munching on the next one. When they've cleared the second, then they move off to the third, and so on, continuously moving in a perpetual circle, allowing the grasses and brush to recover every time. Not everyone will like to hear this, but the best options for meat and milk are the chaotic goats. Putting their naughty and rambunctious natures aside, they are by far the most economical animal you can keep for production of all of the livestock. Like we mentioned before, bovines are more limited in what they can consume, but not the mighty little goat. They'll be able to eat 30% more of what's growing than the cows can, and that's a meager estimate. That percentage can go higher depending on where you live. Between goats and sheep, no matter how wet or dry your environment is, they are the only 2 truly grazing animals that won't require additional feed, and that can milk a patch of soil for all that it's worth. They don't mind the climate, they're incredibly healthy, and they breed faster than cattle. The only time you'll need to supply them with food is if you live in a climate that gets heavy snow during winter months. From goats, you'll get milk that's higher in butterfat and plenty of protein. It's not like you'll be settling for less with goat meat either. There are plenty of breeds out there that deliver a carcass fat enough that you can't tell the difference between goat and mutton on the butcher's hook. And they do it all while still producing milk for the family. Since they breed relatively fast, a family of 5 only needs to keep a dozen at a time. If you have at least 1 ram, that's enough to milk them, while still leaving plenty left for the does to give to their kids. And you won't just have enough meat to fill the freezer, you'll probably have so many kids at the end of the breeding season that you end up selling the excess for profit. Under ideal conditions, you can go up to 15 goats at a time. They just need to have enough to eat and space to tussle and jump around to their heart's content. It really just depends on how much your goats have at their disposal to keep them entertained. If they don't have enough to keep them busy, then they start looking for ways to escape or to fight with each other to get all that pent-up aggression out of them. 15 is too many for 5 acres in our opinion for one reason only: overgrazing. Any number higher than a dozen will clear out land faster than the previous one can recover. Only the pygmies and the Nigerian dwarf goats can be pushed to higher herd numbers. They're less prone to boredom, much more calm, and their size means that they'll eat half of what a medium to large breed of goat will. Set 1 acre aside. And here's where you start utilizing the second of your 5 acres. If you consistently grow grains on an acre through the 2 growing seasons of the year, 3 seasons if you have the option, then you can grow and store enough grain for your livestock for those winter shortages. With that, you can even make up quite a bit of your household and your chickens' needs, if you are selective about what you grow. Personally, we'd advise a variation of grains for the most nutritional scope as possible. Everything from hay to corn and whatever else can yield the most in the environment that you grow it in. Even after putting 1 acre aside for field crops, you still have 3 acres left that'll mainly be used for rotational grazing, and that's way too much for a dozen goats under normal circumstances. Of course, if you don't want to keep any other livestock besides goats and chickens, then you can keep 15 to 20 goats in that space. That brings us to the sheep. No livestock breeds faster than sheep do, and they are by far the easiest of the hooved varieties to keep on your property. We specifically want to focus on hair sheep today. Wool sheep are just as good, don't get us wrong, but let's face it, that's a lot of labor for shearing and specialized feed to make sure that the fleece is of the best quality. After all the extra care, there isn't that big of a market out there to sell the wool to. Wool sheep take away from the ease of care that sheep are supposed to be known for, whereas hair sheep are about as close to a goat in terms of care and feed as you can get, minus the rambunctiousness. They can forage just as well as the goats can, thanks to nearly identical digestive tracts. They're chilled out and friendly, and they don't have that insane drive to escape their confinement. If they're safe, well-fed and healthy, your sheep would much rather stay close to their human handlers where safety is guaranteed. You can absolutely get yourself a milk sheep and discard the goats altogether. Unfortunately, the few breeds out there that can supply milk are mostly bred to endure cold climates and don't do well in the heat. We'd rather stay with the goats for the milk though. Not that there's anything wrong with sheep's milk, the goats just provide a larger amount and they have more butter fat. Now here comes the question, with those 3 acres that are left, that already have goats running on it, then how large can your flock be? A dozen is the limit. Again, we need to remind you that most sheep breeds are more fertile than goats. So you're going to have to time your butchering just right so that you don't have too many animals to feed that your land can't sustain. If you'd rather just keep the goats for their milk and not their meat, instead relying on the sheep for their mutton, then we'd advise going down to 5 goats, 4 does, and a ram, and 15 sheep. If your grazing is phenomenal, especially for those who have forested areas or are next to other properties that will allow you to come in to clear land for them, you can keep 20 sheep per acre at a time. Back to that extra acre. Even after your infrastructure, the chickens, goats and sheep taking up the first 4 acres, that still leaves that 1 extra acre we mentioned for planting grain, corn, hay, or whatever you need to feed the animals on during the cold months. Even if you don't live where there are completely barren winters to consider, we'd still encourage you to keep that acre open, instead of increasing your livestock. There are several reasons we say this. For one, even in the ideal growing zones, the seasons aren't set in stone. A year of drought, maybe extreme flooding, a herd of deer just walks in and eats it all. Heck, a tornado could come through and rip half your land to shreds. There are a billion different things that could deplete grasses and feed overnight. That extra acre doesn't just have to act as an in-case-of-emergency grain fund for you either, just include it into your rotational grazing schedule. That way you can be absolutely sure that you won't ever have to overgraze, leaving enough behind to bounce back quicker every time you move your animals. That extra acre is also a good place to isolate any animals that need to be quarantined due to sickness or because they've just given birth. It's the kind of place where you can keep other animals that you're experimenting with to see if it'll be worth your while, like hogs or ducks. Just because the standard model we advise doesn't include an animal, doesn't mean you shouldn't try it at all. Additional considerations. If your environment is extremely harsh, you might have to have 1 or 2 sheep less, sure. But that's why herding animals are so great. They breed fast enough to expand your flock fast enough to make use of the excess feed you didn't realize you had at your disposal, but they can also be slaughtered for profit if you have too little growing on your property. Our estimates were generous, and there will always be some level of personal observation on your part that'll be necessary. Natural forage isn't the only thing to take into account, not by a long shot. You might find that the workload is too heavy for one person, or that you underestimated yourself and you can actually handle double that amount. If you do have the financial freedom to bring in extra feed, that changes the game completely. 5 acres is enormous. With extra hay at your disposal, you can absolutely keep a few heads of cattle and double all of the rest of your animals. Maybe keeping only one species is more profitable for you, and you end up preferring to focus on just one kind of livestock. Or you find that keeping a few hogs and a couple of free-range ducks won't break the bank or cost you too much extra labor after all. If you are interested in extending to some other species, here are a few statistics for you to think about. Generally, the experts agree that 1 head of cattle per acre is sufficient, and that pans out if you only have a single milking cow that runs alongside other ruminant animals. But if you are practicing rotational grazing, you can totally bring that up to 2 cows. If you're bringing in hay for them, then you can comfortably keep 4 or 5 on an acre. But they will clear that patch completely of anything that's green in no time, and it's never a good idea to overgraze to that degree. For the swine, 8 pigs per acre is the usual estimate, but we double that amount. Pigs need food brought to them, they don't graze. So if you're planning your space well with enough separation between your butcher pigs, farrowing sows, and pens for boars to keep them apart when it's appropriate, 16 pigs an acre isn't even close to your limit. Here it's more about how much physical labor and resources like feed, infrastructure, and veterinary costs you're willing to pay for. Animals like quail and meat rabbits don't even need to be taken into the equation. They take up so little room that they'll fit in perfectly comfortably on that acre reserved for your home and immediate garden. If you run chickens alone, you can keep thousands on 4 acres. If you set up a mealworm farm and grow grains on 1 acre, you literally won't be able to keep track of the number of chickens that space can hold. If you're utilizing chicken tractors to house them, then 500 chickens per acre is a good estimate, give or take 100 or so. If you're free-ranging them completely, we'd opt for 400 chickens per acre, just because those little T-Rexes can root and scratch up a space just as fast as pigs can. And you want to be careful not to overgraze. Then we need to make 2 very important points before we end this discussion. First, you will need to limit the number of males on your property. Obviously your livestock will have to breed, so you'll need a ram for your sheep and goats and 1 rooster for every 10 hens or so. But keep your gentlemen at the minimum, especially when you're working with 10 acres or less. Fact of the matter is, your space just isn't big enough for animals to get away from each other if they get worked up when there are ladies in heat, or as is the case with goats and hogs, they're just more volatile, and tight spaces can exacerbate their aggressiveness. Besides, the more girls there are for any male to service, the more he'll have at his disposal to sufficiently work off all that excess testosterone. Secondly, actively sow native weeds, grass, and brush. By focusing on native species that are edible to your region, you won't just be giving your animals more to forage. You'll be adding root structures in the ground that'll retain water and stave off erosion. It doesn't matter how dry it is where you live. The more green you encourage, the more green there'll be. You are only as self-sufficient as there is food for your livestock to eat naturally. That said, a mixture of sheep, chickens, and goats will supply you with enough meat, milk, and eggs to feed a family, to make an extra income, and you'll have enough to have a garden, an orchard, space for all your infrastructure, and at the end of the day, still enough room left over to play with. Because no matter how specifically you plan any land, you will end up with the desire to experiment with an animal, a crop, or you find that there's a variable specific to your circumstances that requires some kind of pen, building, or something that you couldn't possibly have accounted for until you actually start with this new venture. So in short, a dozen sheep, a dozen goats, and 90 to 100 chickens will feed you and your family comfortably for the year without the need to bring in feed for them if you practice mindful rotational grazing. A dairy cow on top of that is possible if you're working with ideal grassland conditions. For the produce, half an acre is all you need for an orchard and garden space. This will be enough for you to eat fresh, to store in the long term, for extra animal feed, and for the market garden. See what we meant when we said that we were being generous? This is going to leave you with more than enough space to keep everyone well fed, while still allowing you the freedom for experimentation, and an extra patch to grow a few grains or corn. If you're in the position to buy 40% of their feed, then you can double those numbers on all counts. So our top 3 self-sustainable animals certainly aren't the limit for your livestock, but they make up the minimal animal requirement needed to sustain a household, with the option to make a profit for you and without depleting your soil completely. So what do you think? Is 5 acres enough to achieve our farm dreams? Tell us your plans below to inspire others. See you next time.